Welcome to Unheard Stories, where we share tales of love, betrayal, and the consequences no one sees coming. This is just one of those stories, a story you won't forget. The house was silent, eerily so, the kind of silence that wasn't comforting but suffocating, like the calm before a storm. The coffee mug sat untouched on the kitchen counter, its steam long since dissipated. In its place, a single sheet of paper stared back at him, its few hastily scrawled words cutting through him like shards of glass. "I need space. Don't try to find me." For a moment he stood frozen, the paper trembling in his hand. The room seemed to tilt, as though the foundation of his life had shifted in an instant. This wasn't a conversation. It wasn't a fight that left room for apologies or explanations. It was abandonment, cold, calculated, and absolute. The woman he had built his life with, the woman he had sacrificed for, had simply walked out. And she hadn't left alone. She'd taken their joint savings, leaving him with nothing but the responsibility of their home, her ailing mother, and a mountain of bills. But the note wasn't the only thing she left behind. In the days that followed, her absence was louder than any argument they had ever had. Her face appeared on social media, smiling in carefree pictures, her captions painted with freedom and adventure. She seemed happy, alive, untouched by the devastation she had left in her wake. He scrolled through those posts, the pit in his stomach deepening with every image. Her carefree expressions mocked him. To her, it seemed, their years together were just a chapter she could close without remorse. Yet, beneath the grief and anger, something darker began to grow. He wasn't the type to react impulsively. No, he was calm, measured, methodical. And he would not let her walk away without facing the consequences of her betrayal. This wasn't just heartbreak. It was war. "You don't just get to destroy my life and walk away," he thought, his grip tightening on the note. What happened next wasn't revenge in the heat of anger. It wasn't a burst of emotion or a rash decision. It was calculated, precise, the kind of retaliation that left no stone unturned and no life unscathed. She thought she had ended his story, but she was wrong. Her actions would unravel everything. Not just for herself, but for the world she had crafted in his absence. And by the time he was done, she would know the true meaning of regret. On the surface, their life had been everything others dreamed of. Friends often joked about how they were the perfect couple, the kind who finished each other's sentences and threw the best holiday parties. They had a charming home, shared dreams of traveling the world in retirement, and the admiration of their children. But beneath that polished exterior, the cracks had started to form long before Mary walked out the door. Mary's mother's health was the first weight to strain their marriage. A sharp, vibrant woman in her younger years, her decline into dementia was both heartbreaking and all-consuming. The man she had once teased and cooked for now became her caregiver, unpaid, untrained, and unprepared for the toll it would take. Mary had promised to shoulder the burden, but over time, it was her husband who stepped in. He rearranged his work schedule to handle medical appointments, bathed her mother when Mary couldn't face it, and dealt with the financial strain of her care. He never complained. He assumed this was what you did for family, for love. But for Mary, her mother's illness was a reminder of her own fears. She began to fixate on what the future held, whispering to him late at night, "What if I lose myself like that? What if you're stuck with me like this one day?" He would hold her close and say, "We'll face it together." Still, the emotional distance grew. She stopped joining him in their evening rituals, the walks after dinner, the late-night wine on the porch where they'd planned their next adventure. She became more withdrawn, spending hours on her phone or scrolling through social media. "Just catching up with friends," she'd say when he asked. But her smile seemed thinner each time, her laughter forced. He dismissed these signs at first. They were under stress after all. But over time, small inconsistencies began to pile up. A message she quickly hid. Nights she claimed to be with friends but came home smelling of a perfume he didn't recognize. One evening, he asked her directly, "Are you happy, Mary?" She hesitated a moment too long. "Of course," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm just tired." It was a lie. He could feel it. He started noticing the little things. How her phone never left her hand, how she'd step outside to take calls, or how her responses to him became curt, almost defensive. The cracks that had once been hairline fractures were now fissures, deep and impossible to ignore. Still, he held on, convincing himself it was just a phase. Every couple went through rough patches. They'd bounce back just like always. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that their perfect life was already slipping through his fingers. The day she left was like any other, or so he thought. The morning routine was familiar. Mary scrolling through her phone while sipping her coffee, him flipping through bills at the kitchen table. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, except for a fleeting moment when her eyes met his, lingering just a second too long. Later that afternoon, he came home to silence. The house felt colder, emptier. At first, he thought she'd gone out to run errands, but then he noticed her coat missing from the rack. Her favorite mug wasn't in the sink. Her phone charger was gone from the bedside table. Panic gripped him as he moved from room to room, calling her name. That's when he saw it. A single sheet of paper folded neatly on the counter. "I need space. Don't try to find me." His heart stopped. His hands trembled as he reread the note, trying to make sense of its finality. The woman he had built his life with, shared his dreams with, had simply vanished. He dialed her number, but it went straight to voicemail. Again and again he tried until finally, a cold automated message told him the line was disconnected. Still clutching the note, he stumbled to the desk where they kept important documents. A sickening feeling churned in his stomach as he logged into their joint bank account. The screen flashed. Balance. $0.00. She had taken everything. Their savings money meant for her mother's care, their daughter's college fund, and their retirement was gone. His breath caught in his throat as reality set in. She hadn't just left him emotionally. She'd left him financially stranded, too. Bills stacked on the counter suddenly felt heavier. The weight of her mother's care, now solely his responsibility, became suffocating. But what stung most wasn't the note or the empty account. It was what came next. Scrolling through social media that evening, he found her. There she was, smiling in a picturesque cafe, posing against a sunset. Her captions filled with phrases like "new beginnings" and "finally free." The comments poured in. "You look amazing. So happy for you. Living your best life." He stared at the photos, disbelief and fury building inside him. While he was left to pick up the pieces, she was crafting a narrative of freedom and empowerment, her betrayal painted as some kind of personal triumph. Their children took the news as hard as he did. Their daughter, just starting college, was devastated. How could she do this? She sobbed on the phone. She didn't even say goodbye. Their son, older and more stoic, was quieter but no less angry. "She left you with everything," he said, his voice sharp. "Everything she didn't want to deal with. And for what? To post selfies?" Neither of them reached out to her. The betrayal cut too deep. He tried to piece together what had gone wrong, replaying their last months together over and over in his mind. Were there signs he had ignored? Had he worked too much? Was it her mother's illness? Or had she simply decided he wasn't enough anymore? No answer came. Just the deafening silence of an empty house and the gnawing knowledge that everything they'd built together was gone. But beneath the grief and anger, something else began to take root. A spark of resolve. You don't get to walk away from this unscathed, he thought. This wasn't over. Not yet. The days after Mary's departure blurred into one another. A haze of anger, confusion, and heartbreak. The house, once filled with shared routines and her mother's soft murmurs, felt like an echo chamber of his thoughts. Every corner held a memory of her. Every room, a reminder of her absence. At first, he avoided telling anyone. Shame pressed down on him, whispering that he'd failed somehow. How else could he explain why his wife had walked out without warning, drained their accounts, and left him to shoulder everything alone? At night, sleep came in brief, restless spurts, interrupted by the memories of her smile, her laughter, the way she'd touch his arm during conversations. He'd wake up gasping, reaching for a presence that wasn't there. He often found himself at the dining table late into the night, staring at bills he didn't have the means to pay. Mary's mother needed medication, home care, and doctor visits, all responsibilities she'd abandoned. He'd agreed to take care of her mother for love, not for this. The emptiness of the house was unbearable. The once warm home felt cold and foreign, like a hollow shell where happiness used to live. Eventually, the truth slipped out during a conversation with his closest friend, Mark. "I can't believe this is happening," he admitted, the words spilling out in a voice that didn't feel like his own. Mark, a quiet and observant man, had long suspected there was trouble beneath the surface of their marriage. But the extent of Mary's betrayal shocked even him. "You can't keep carrying this alone," Mark said. "You need to talk to a lawyer. Protect what's left." His children, too, rallied around him. His daughter sent texts filled with encouragement. "You didn't deserve this, Dad." His son showed up on weekends, helping with errands and sitting in silent solidarity. Still, their support couldn't fill the void she'd left or erase the questions that haunted him. At first, his anger came in flashes, quick, hot bursts that faded into exhaustion. But over time, it began to solidify, sharpening into something colder, something more determined. The social media posts Mary shared became fuel for his resolve. Each carefree caption felt like a slap in the face, a taunt from someone who believed she'd escaped unscathed. He started keeping a notebook, jotting down everything he could remember. Her behavior in the weeks before she left, the bank transactions, even the cryptic messages he'd glimpsed on her phone. "You don't just get to walk away from this," he muttered to himself one night, his pen pressing hard enough to tear the paper. This wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about justice, about making sure Mary understood the weight of what she'd done. The moment of clarity came during an otherwise unremarkable afternoon. While sorting through a pile of unopened mail, he found a letter addressed to Mary. It was from a credit card company, detailing charges he didn't recognize. Charges made after she'd left. Luxury dinners, boutique shopping, a weekend at a spa. She was still spending, still enjoying the life she'd stolen from him. Something inside him snapped. "This ends now," he thought, his mind racing. He closed the notebook, slid it into a drawer, and picked up his phone. First, he called the bank to freeze any remaining accounts. Then, he searched for the number of a divorce attorney Mark had recommended weeks earlier. It was time to take control. Revenge wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. For him, it was a calculated process, cold, methodical, and precise. Every move Mary had made since she left was carefully analyzed. Every piece of information weaponized for maximum impact. His first step was to consult a lawyer. He walked into the meeting armed with a folder of evidence. Financial records showing the drained accounts, screenshots of her extravagant spending, and even her carefree social media posts. "I don't just want a divorce," he told the lawyer, his voice steady. "I want to make sure she doesn't walk away from this without consequences." The lawyer, a sharp and seasoned professional, nodded approvingly. "We'll make sure of that." They worked together to close joint accounts, liquidate assets Mary couldn't access, and draft divorce papers with terms that left no room for manipulation. The opportunity for a dramatic move came sooner than expected. Mary had been using one of their mutual friends as a confidant, spinning her own narrative about escaping a suffocating marriage. This friend, unaware of the full truth, invited both of them to a mutual acquaintance's party, a gathering filled with their shared social circle. It was perfect. On the night of the party, he arrived quietly, armed with a folder containing printed screenshots of Mary's extravagant charges and social media posts. He didn't speak to her when he walked in. Instead, he made his way to a prominent spot, where everyone could see him, and began distributing the documents. The whispers started immediately. People gathered in small clusters, their faces a mix of shock and disgust as they scanned the pages. Mary, oblivious at first, eventually noticed the growing attention. "What's going on?" she asked. Approaching one of her friends, the friend hesitated before handing her a paper. Mary's face turned pale as she read her own words, the evidence of her betrayal laid bare for everyone to see. He stood calmly, watching as the weight of her actions came crashing down on her. She stumbled toward him, her voice low but furious. "How could you do this?" "How could I not?" he replied, his tone cold. "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed all of this." He gestured to the room full of people, their eyes locked on her. But the public humiliation was only the beginning. A week later, Mary was served divorce papers during another gathering, a family dinner she had orchestrated to regain sympathy from their children. As she sat at the table, pretending to play the role of a devoted mother, a courier walked in, placed the envelope in front of her, and left. She opened it, her expression shifting from confusion to panic as she realized the extent of what she'd lost. The terms were brutal but fair. Limited financial support, no claim to the house, and full custody of her mother's care placed squarely on her shoulders. "What is this?" she stammered, looking across the table at him. "This," he said, his voice calm, "is me taking back my life." The ultimate act of retaliation came in the form of a carefully timed post. Using the same platform Mary had used to flaunt her freedom, he shared a single, calculated message. Sometimes, people who claim they've found their happiness forget what they've destroyed to get it. Just a reminder. The truth always comes out. Attached were images of the financial records, her social media captions, and a heartfelt letter from their daughter, expressing the pain of being abandoned. The response was immediate and brutal. Messages of support flooded his inbox, while Mary's once cheering audience turned on her. Her phone was silent, her carefully crafted persona shattered. In the weeks that followed, Mary tried to contact him. First, it was angry texts demanding explanations. Then came the apologies, the tearful voicemails. "I made a mistake," she sobbed in one message. "We can fix this. I'll come home. Please." He didn't respond. For him, the revenge wasn't about taking her back. It was about making her face the consequences of her actions. And now she was left to deal with them alone. Mary had always thrived on attention, but now the spotlight had turned cold. Her once cheerful social media feed was a wasteland of hostile comments and unfollows. The same friends who had praised her for starting fresh now avoided her calls, their sympathy replaced by judgment. Her children, once her pride and joy, refused to speak to her. Their daughter blocked her on every platform, while her son, though more restrained, sent a single, cutting text: "You left us all behind. Don't expect us to wait for you to come back." Her world shrank rapidly. Without the financial support of her husband or access to their savings, Mary struggled to maintain the lifestyle she had flaunted. Bills piled up, credit cards maxed out, and the carefree glow she'd once displayed faded into desperation. Left with little choice, Mary returned to the one thing she had ignored for so long: her mother. Caring for her mother was no longer a shared burden but entirely her responsibility. The daily grind of managing medications, doctor appointments, and sleepless nights took its toll. Every day was a reminder of what she had abandoned, and the partner who had once shouldered it all without complaint. Regret sets in. For the first time, Mary began to see the full picture of her choices. It wasn't just her marriage she had destroyed. It was her family's trust, her children's respect, and the stability she had taken for granted. Nights were the hardest. Alone in her small apartment, Mary would scroll through photos of happier times, her finger hovering over the call button on her phone. But no amount of apologies could undo the damage she had caused, and deep down, she knew it. "I thought I was escaping," she wrote in her journal one night, tears smudging the ink. "But all I did was trap myself in a prison of my own making." While Mary struggled, her husband's life began to flourish. The community, seeing the strength he displayed during the ordeal, rallied around him. His children became his greatest supporters, their bond stronger than ever. He started to rebuild, not just financially but emotionally. There were moments of reflection, of course, and the occasional pang of nostalgia. But those moments no longer paralyzed him. Instead, they reminded him of how far he had come. For Mary, life became a slow, uphill climb. With no one to lean on and no way to escape the weight of her decisions, she faced her new reality alone. Standing on the porch one evening, he watched the sunset stretch across the horizon. The house, once heavy with memories of betrayal and loss, now felt lighter, brighter even. The silence no longer suffocated him. It had become peaceful, a reminder of the calm he had reclaimed. In the months since Mary left, his life had transformed. What began as devastation had turned into an opportunity to rediscover himself. He reflected on the nights spent questioning his worth, replaying the what-ifs in his head. Now, those thoughts felt distant, like echoes of a storm that had finally passed. I didn't deserve what happened to me, he thought, but I'm stronger for having survived it. His children became his closest allies during the aftermath. Their bond, once strained by the chaos Mary left behind, grew stronger. Family dinners became a weekly tradition, filled with laughter and shared stories. "I'm proud of you, Dad," his daughter told him one night as they cleared the table. "You didn't let her break you." Their words were a salve, healing the wounds Mary's betrayal had inflicted. Together, they forged a new kind of family, one built on resilience and mutual support. Slowly, he began to open himself up to the idea of a future beyond Mary. It wasn't about rushing into something new, but about rediscovering the parts of himself he had set aside during their marriage. He picked up old hobbies, rekindled friendships, and even started traveling, something he and Mary had always dreamed of but never achieved. On one trip, a hiking group introduced him to someone who reminded him what connection felt like. Her name was Emma. She was kind, funny, and had a warmth that felt effortless. They took things slow, sharing long conversations and small moments of joy. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope, not just for love, but for the life he deserved. Looking back, he realized Mary's betrayal had taught him more than he expected. It wasn't just about learning to let go of someone who hurt him. It was about valuing himself enough to rebuild without them. "Trust is fragile," he said in a reflective moment. "But so is regret. If you let it, it'll eat you alive. The trick is to take what you've learned and use it to build something better." He no longer carried bitterness for what Mary had done. Instead, he carried gratitude for the lessons, the growth, and the people who stood by him when everything fell apart. To anyone going through heartbreak, betrayal, or loss, let this story remind you. It's okay to feel lost. It's okay to grieve. But don't let someone else's actions define your life. You have the power to rebuild, to find joy, and to live a life that's bigger and better than the pain you've endured. If my story has resonated with you, or if you're drawn to real-life tales of love, betrayal, and redemption, there's so much more to explore here on Unheard Stories. Subscribe now to uncover raw, emotional journeys and life-changing moments that will keep you hooked. Follow us to never miss a new story, because some lessons are best learned through the experiences of others. Join the growing community of listeners who dare to face the messy, unpredictable side of human relationships. Hit that subscribe button now, because the next story might just be the one you need to hear.